Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of City Lights Live, the online version of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravelis. Today, City Lights and our dear friends at Shakespeare and Company in Paris celebrate the publication of their new book, the Shakespeare and Company Book of Interviews. It is edited by Adam Biles and published by Canongate Books. Shakespeare and Company is one of the world's most iconic, unique, and truly beautiful bookshops. Located on the banks of the Seine opposite Notre-Dame in the city of Paris, it has long served as a meeting place for anglophone readers and writers. As many of you know, City Lights shares a special relationship with Shakespeare and Company. Our founder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and George Whitman, the founder of Shakespeare and Company, were lifelong friends, and George served as a role model, inspiring Ferlinghetti in the founding of City Lights. So Lawrence always referenced Shakespeare and Company throughout the course of his life as the kind of spiritual sister store to City Lights. So today's event is especially auspicious for us. The Shakespeare and Company Book of Interviews is both a celebration of the literary life and of a remarkable meeting place. The book was 10 years in the making and charts the visitations of the remarkable writers that have crossed the shop's threshold and appeared in its event series. Over the years, Shakespeare and Company has hosted several hundred interviews with writers ranging from prize-winning novelists to visionary nonfiction writers. This thoughtfully curated book is a selection of some of the best of these interviews. So we're delighted to have with us today the book's editor, Adam Biles. He is a writer,
Hello.
translator, and has served as the literary director at Shakespeare and Company, from where he hosts their weekly podcast and where he curated the podcast series Friends of Shakespeare and Company Read Ulysses. We will also be joined today by our dear friend Sylvia Whitman. Sylvia is the proprietor of Shakespeare and Company and the daughter of its late founder, George Whitman. So it's a truly homecoming today, you could say. We also have Paul Yamazaki, who is the principal buyer at City Lights and also the backbone of the ordering process at the store. Very, very honored to have him in the room as well. We will be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of the book. We'll also make some time at the end of our program for questions from the audience, so please do post them in that same chat function. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to Adam Biles and Sylvia Whitman. Such a delight and a pleasure to have you both with us. Welcome to the virtual City Lights.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be with you all. We wish we were actually in the beautiful City Lights in that poetry room upstairs, but this is the second best, and we're very happy to be here.
So I'd like us to begin first by offering our audience a little bit of background. I mean, some of them, of course, know of Shakespeare and Company, but some may not. So would you offer us a little context for the uninitiated? I mean, tell us a little bit about the trajectory of the history of the shop, if you would.
Well, how much time do we have? So I took over from the bookshop from my father, George Whitman, who was an American from Boston, who arrived in Paris in the late 1940s on the GI Bill, and he was looking for a city to fall in love with, a city that kind of lived and breathed poetry, and that's what he said he found in Paris. And immediately bringing it back to City Lights, this is actually the time that he met Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was also in Paris on the GI Bill, and they met through George's sister at a hotel near the bookshop. And Lawrence said that George's hotel room was filled with books, and he was kind of already had set up a sort of unofficial bookshop in this hotel room. And so Lawrence kind of encouraged him to set up a bookshop here in Paris. So the friendship started then. And George, had been he had been traveling the world, and it was time that he wanted to settle down. But books being the center of his life, they had to sort of be the center part of it. And so he found this beautiful space here opposite Notre-Dame and opened a one room in 1951, and then slowly expanded it bit by bit. Everything he did, I mean, he was basically living in a novel. Like everything he did was for and about the bookshop and for books. So from the first day, he had his doors open to anyone who loved books and anyone who needed a place to stay, who loved books, or a bowl of stew. And so he started out like that, and And he was very much inspired by the first chapter of Shakespeare and Company, which was opened by another American called Sylvia Beach. And Sylvia Beach opened her bookshop, Shakespeare and Company, at Rue de l'Odéon, so just a kind of a few blocks away from the current one in the 6th arrondissement. And she she opened her bookshop there. It quickly became a sort of mecca for all the big writers of the 20s in Paris, and there were many. But a key part of her bookshop was being opposite a French bookshop called La Maison des Amis des Livres, which was opened by Adrienne Monnier, who was one of the first women in France to open a bookshop. And I think very pertinent to this conversation, she was also one of the first people to start hosting events in a bookshop. So she kind of, and together with Sylvia Beach, really cultivated this incredible kind of welcoming, hospitable, a home away from the home for writers. And together with these two amazing bookshops, one French and one Anglophone, they sort of cross-pollinated Anglophone and French writers. And like one example is obviously Ulysses by James Joyce, which Sylvia Beach famously published in 1922 when no one else dared. And Adrienne Monnier did the French translation and published versions of the French translation in her magazine Navire d'Argent. So anyway, that was a kind of incredible story. And Sylvia Beach sadly had to close her bookshop in 1941 when a Nazi officer wanted to buy her last copy of Finnegan's Wake in the window, and she refused. And he said he would be back the following day to close her down. And so she, with her friends, closed herself down that night. And painted over the name Shakespeare and Company. She never reopened, but she remained a kind of influential figure in the Paris literary scene until her death in 1962. And so my father was obviously very well aware of her reputation and everything that she had done. And he was incredibly inspired by her and wanted to continue this very welcoming, event-filled space for Anglophone writers and international writers. And they actually were acquaintances and became friends through various authors that they knew in common, like Richard Wright and James Baldwin and James Jones, who ordered events here at this bookshop, and Sylvia Beach came to that. So anyway, so that was the kind of connection and the inspiration. And then George kind of kept on, and the movement when George was starting out his bookshop was the beat movement. So a lot of the beatniks were living down the road in a hotel, the Beat Hotel in the 6th arrondissement. And so William Burroughs, for example, did a reading of Naked Lunch here. Gregory Corso spent a lot of time, Allen Ginsberg, as well as other writers like Anais Nin and Lawrence Durrell. And so it just kind of sort of grew and grew, and he, this kind of kingdom of books that he made, this kind of labyrinth of books just sort of expanded. And he dedicated his whole life to the space and to the writers and readers that came through. And I'm lucky enough with my team now to try and continue that spirit and that kind of, that destiny.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Adam, I want to bring you into the conversation. I mean, I know as a programmer, it's often difficult to decide, who and what goes on the program and what doesn't. I mean, there's only so many days in the week that one has to really make some hard choices. And here at City Lights, we've always gravitated towards the writers we love, whose work appears exceptional to us in some way. Our programming isn't influenced by such arbiters of taste as the New York Times bestseller list. So what informs your process? I mean, is it something similar? And also talk a little bit about, what it's like for you to have this position. I mean, it sounds amazing.
It is amazing. I think the word process is probably a little bit strong for what goes into the programming. Like, it's very much, as you said, it's finding the books you love, following your nose, and then particularly in our case, finding a way to get those writers to come to Paris, because it's not always obvious to publishers in the States or in the UK that as part of a book tour, they should send a writer to Paris. So yeah, I spend a lot of time in conversation with our booksellers, with our head buyer Linda Fallon as well. I share an office with her. We're constantly talking about the new titles that are coming up, and it might be writers that we've loved before. It might be writers who we've taken an interest in, and we've watched their career developing. It's sometimes a little bit hard to kind of pass the hyperbole, let's say, of the publishing industry. So every new book you're finding out about is a masterpiece, or it's the the biggest hit of the season. So really it's a case very much of kind of following my nose and trying to figure out what I'm interested in, because if I'm going to be on stage with the writer and interview them, if I'm not genuinely interested in what they've been doing, then it's not going to make for an interesting conversation. I think luckily for me, my interests do kind of I cast my net quite wide with my interests. So, as a novelist myself, of course, I'm fascinated by novels and novelists and how they work and how they create the books that they do. But also, I mean, in the interview book we have, for example, Carlo Rovelli, the theoretical physicist, and Carlo has a particularly poetic bent, probably more than a lot of theoretical physicists. So I don't know, I haven't met that many, but so there's definitely a fit there. But it's really a case of finding out what I love, what I'm interested in, and what will work in the bookstore as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many parallels between us because, Paul, who's here in the room, and I work very, very closely. And the next season, we're scouring for new material. Mm-hmm. We're always having discussions about it. And editors actually play a really, really huge role for us. I mean, do you find the same thing, that you've formed relationships with, some of these editors? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, in Paris, we're on a little bit of an island sometimes. So it's some of the challenge is actually getting in touch with these editors and getting to meet them, and also getting them to come to events as well. Because as I said, sometimes it can be a bit tricky to convince publishers to send us people. But if they come to the event, if an editor comes to an event, or a publisher or a publicist comes to an event, and they see what we do, and they see how special an event is at Shakespeare and Company, and that I don't want to, not to be boastful. It's not, I'm just a small part of that. It's the space, it's the audience, it's the ambience, it's the history. And once we do have editors who come over and they've discovered what we do, it does get it gets easier to have those conversations, and they give you leads for the forthcoming season. They speak to you frankly about what they're most excited about, and what they think would work for the bookshop as well.
Yeah. Upon leafing through the new book, I mean, one immediately notices just this continuity between the conversations. I mean, it beautifully flows from one to the other. I was very impressed by how you did that. Yeah.
I mean, again, it's not necessarily something I would take credit for. Like, I suppose, I think I might say this in the preface that I wrote, that I can see when I read it many of my own personal concerns, whether that be with my writing, my reading, with my life. And so, sometimes when I might ask, I don't know, Carlo Rovelli or Carlo Knausgaard or Colson Whitehead something, I can remember what the sort of the reasoning was behind that question, because it was something I genuinely wanted to know about their book and about their mind. So I think that sort of thematic continuity is in part just because, again, it's that thing of sort of following my nose. But I was actually surprised to find it there. And sometimes it's so beautiful. So, for example, Annie Ernaux and Carlo Rovelli both talk about time, but they talk about time from very different perspectives. And yet, I don't know, I'm not sure, maybe I'm wrong, but I can't imagine anyone would think to program them together at a literary festival. And yet, having the two essentially converse between the covers of this book, you can really feel that interaction. And what links them is the space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in fact, that's the thing I wanted to talk about next. Is there is something about the physical space that really lends itself to the magic of Shakespeare and Company. You've managed to kind of maintain a lot of its aesthetic integrity over the years. And also the shop has served as an actual home to authors, and kind of lends itself to the building of community. If you could talk about, well, the challenge of trying to maintain that space. I mean, because you do have the challenge of just a very large influx of people, and yet the last time I was there, it just looks fantastic in there.
Well, when George bought the first room of the bookshop in 1951, he learned it was condemned. The building was condemned.
Wow.
And then he asked, well, when was it condemned? And they said it was condemned in 1870. So he said, well, I'm going to take my risk that it will stand up another few years. But it is challenging because it's a 17th century building. And so there are constant, I mean, the number of conversations we have about leaks, there should be a book that we write that we kind of we turn it into some kind of poetry collection just for the sanity of our brains, because we have so many conversations about leaks. But it is a challenge, but then I realize sometimes there were moments where I'd get frustrated, and I'd sometimes say to Adam, oh, we should just do this event in I don't know, a cinema next door or something. But then I realized that actually they've come here for this space. And that's part of the reason. And it makes me think of, my father said that he hadn't written a novel, but every corner of the bookshop was a chapter of his unwritten novel. And it does feel very personal. I think that personality and that spirit really does come through. And even though sometimes when we're setting up an event, and we don't have a space like, for example, Foyle's bookshop in London, I was like filled with envy when I went to visit, and they have an entire floor ready for events with chairs that are already out, just waiting for the author and the readers. And we have to sort of turn everything upside down and push customers, or actually sometimes ask customers, can you help me move this table? Put aside that pile of books, get involved, And so we have to really like kind of deal with this, like turning things upside down in this sort of small labyrinth of a space. But then when the conversation starts taking place, often after the sort of initial stress of just trying to deal with that space and prepare it for an event, there's this amazing kind of, I mean, when it's a good conversation, there's this sort of sense of electricity that takes place in the room. And it's this kind of, I mean, I don't want to embarrass you, Paul, but I feel like this line in your book, it made me think so much about what we try and do. Books become the fulcrum of conversation. The books by themselves could get you there as an individual, but for most of us, the dialogue back and forth increases the possibility of joy. I think that's the point of being a bookseller, and the point of reading, and really the point of life. And I couldn't agree more with that. And I feel like that conversation is what we're seeking in this space. And to quote another writer that I often quote, Lewis Busby with his lovely book, The Yellow Lighted Bookshop, which I've quoted many times about that these spaces are kind of a combination of solitude and gathering. And I really, you feel that when people are quietly browsing, but I definitely feel that when we're sitting together in union, listening to a conversation about books, which, I mean, is just an excuse to talk about life.
Yeah. I would add about the space. One thing you feel when you're on stage there is you feel the kind of the layers of history contributing to making this event special. So you'd have the 17th century bricks, and you have the history of it was a sort of a monastery, and you could feel that sort of place of gathering there. And then you feel, what George did. And Sylvia, at the start you said about, it was a place for hosting people, and George hosted people and gave them stew, and that idea of hosting has been crucial, I think, through the history of Shakespeare and Company and through George's life, and then when Sylvia and David have been running for the last few decades. Like, one of the things I think that makes my job as an interviewer so much easier is writers feel hosted. They feel they've come to a place where they are essentially home, and where nothing bad is going to happen to them, and they're going to be comfortable and they're going to have a nice time. And I think it opens them up in a way. Like I've done chairing at festivals and other things like that, and you can always, almost regardless of the context, you can have a good conversation with people. But every time I begin an event at Shakespeare and Company, you could just feel like the ground has been prepared for the conversation to become something special. And that is, as I say, like it's what Sylvia and David have done the last 20 years. It's what George did for the 50 years before that. And it's, I guess what Paris did in the centuries before. And I'm, very, very grateful to be able to step onto stage in that context, because it definitely softens the writers up for me.
But I think it's also about being in a space filled with books that is, where people really care about the books, and you have that at City Lights as well. And so it's that, I don't know, it's for me, it's also like a celebration of curiosity. Like when I look at this collection of interviews in this book, and you have, I don't know, Knausgaard talking about memory, and how difficult it is, how untruthful it can be, memory, or you have Annie Ernaux combining the personal and the political, or Colson Whitehead talking about his amazing book about slavery, or Leila Slimani talking about a bourgeois Parisian family paying someone to love their children by hiring a nanny. Like the subjects are so diverse, and we we have that that continues with the events program. Like the other week we had someone, Francesca Wade, talking about her new biography of Gertrude Stein, and suddenly we were like brought back to Paris of the 1920s. Or we had like Irvin Welsh talking about his cult novel sequel to his cult novel Trainspotting, and we were in Scotland in the 90s, and but I feel like this is just kind of this amazing environment of bringing books to life, and the fact that what's at the heart of that for me is a sense of curiosity, and keeping that sense of curiosity and being thrown into someone else's skin or someone else's world, and doing and being in, I mean, that is reading, but doing that with having that experience with other people in the room, also listening to the same person, I think is really special.
You make me think of something. We were just talking about this event before, but that event we did in 2017, just before the first Trump inauguration, where John Freeman hosted a panel with Nathan Englander, ZZ Packer, and Alexander Hemmon about what to expect from America under Trump. But I remember from the audience Q&A, there was a moment somebody asked a question along the lines of, "But like, what is this? This is, what if we're just here, just like in a bubble?" And Sasha Hemmon said, "Well, this is a bubble, but it's in bubbles that movements start," or something like that. And I think there was just something so inspiring about that, because I think often bookish people, liberal people, have a sense of, a little bit of kind of self-flagellation about like, what are we all doing here? And to have somebody, particularly someone like Sasha, talking, seeing the value in a group of not entirely like-minded people, but like people gathering to talk about a book, to consider ideas, to reflect, to pause in a space, is something really valuable and really undervalued, I think, in our current context.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there is this element of literary diplomacy, because we think about who has passed through both of our shops. I remember when Václav Havel was, prime minister, and he would come and visit Lawrence. And some of the conversations, I was lucky to be kind of the fly on the wall to kind of like listen to some of their conversations. And the fact that a poet and painter could actually give courage to a world leader, I mean, that those moments didn't get lost on us. We were like, And I sensed something very, very similar about Shakespeare and Company. I mean, there's a sign up in City Lights, and I think Lawrence got that quote from George, and the sign says, "Where the streets of the world meet the avenues of the mind." And this is something that's always kind of had an impact on me thinking about that and what that means for us. And sometimes we don't know the impact that we have, but we
Mhm.
do. If you think about all the different people that have actually even passed through, and maybe we haven't even hosted them, or maybe they haven't, like been special settings or whatever, but that those books do reach them and have an impact, and then they go on to do what they do in the world. So yeah, there is that aspect, the literary
Mhm.
diplomacy.
But
Paul, I
George
don't know,
used
maybe
to,
you have something to say about that too.
Well, I think I was inspired by and strongly agree with Sylvia using the word curiosity. I think that's kind of at the heart of what we do as booksellers and as readers. And it's and certainly for myself as a reader and a bookseller, it's just curiosity, opening the book up and asking, how did this marvelous book, this book that I love so much, get into my hands? And following that curiosity leads to so many other conversations, and it, like,
Mhm.
oftentimes leads to, like, having conversations with John Freeman, and just, like, watching what, like, I think it's one of the things that City Lights, there's so many things that City Lights and Shakespeare, both in its history and our current practices, share in common. But I think it is really bound in what Sylvia just mentioned as curiosity, and being able to do that. And so, and
Mhm.
I think that curiosity leads to the conversations. And, like, I think a mutual friend of both Shakespeare and City Lights is John Freeman, who's just kind of, we've been able to watch his kind of, like, from a book reviewer, independent with no institutional affiliations, kind of travel the world, bring so many writers and readers together, and now in his role at Knopf, and then continuing to do, like, I participate in the California Book Club that's sponsored
Yeah.
by Alta Magazine, that John conducts, like Adam, these remarkable conversations that we're so privileged to be able to kind of drop into, and, like, in the fact that they're archived, and that just kind of widens our ocean of and the possibility of curiosity. So I thank you both for all that.
on the
I think
curiosity factor, sorry, Adam,
no,
I
you go.
also think like this is like the great anti-age solution, because if you look at Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who lived to what, 101, and then
Yeah.
George to 98, and George anyway was reading like a book a day, and it could be a science book or a mystery book or true crime or the latest novel by Paul Auster. And it was, there was that sense of curiosity was really keeping him going. And I just want to mention this lovely section in the George Saunders interview
Mm.
for his book Lincoln in the Bardo, where he says, "What's the point of a novel? It's actually not to get everything right. It's not to catalogue a historical period. It's not to show the truth about the Civil War or even the geography of a graveyard. It's to kind of put the reader into that state where she goes, shit, wow, to find ourselves in that kind of irreducible, non-conceptual state of wonder that we go into after receiving a good work of art. That actually is the only end game."
Mm.
Beautiful.
Lovely.
That is beautiful. Well, I want to remind everyone, please do post your questions and comments in the chat function. We have some photos to look at. There we are.
So this one is just a kind of, my dad used to like to call them happenings, but I don't think we call them happenings anymore. But I love that term. But this was just a kind of little gathering. There were a couple of years where the bookshop was actually closed and not allowed to do business, and he decided to keep the bookshop open as a free University of Paris. And so there were a lot of the students from the Sorbonne who would come, and anti-Vietnam groups who would come and discuss political issues, and just get together, talk about latest books. And so that's a kind of good example of a gathering like that.
Mhm.
And that's another, that's not a specific event. I don't know what that one was, but you can see George in the background with a pile
Yeah.
of books. And he was
Mm.
often very shy, actually, and he loved to get people together, but then to step out of the room and go and read a book in another room.
There are so many
Leave it
parallels.
to the authors. Yeah.
There are so many parallels between him and Lawrence. I mean, Lawrence was very similar.
Yeah, I think they were very happy to be the readers and not,
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, Lawrence obviously is a great writer, but also happy to take that position of letting other writers, take the stage. And that is an event that was going on downstairs in our fiction room. I think that's like probably in the early 70s. And yeah, I mean, it was just people sitting and squeezing in wherever they could. This is just it's a Lagun artist collaboration where they kind of took a lot of historical figures at the bookshop and piled them all in, so that there wasn't actually an event there wherein Iceman and Hemingway appeared, but this is a sort of imaginative one.
So yeah, we have Karlove Knausgaard. I think one of there are certain of the. I mean, I don't think many of the interviews in this book, they're not particularly quotable in the sense that you can pull out one or two lines. I think they exist as whole conversations, but there are certain moments, like I remember from this one with Karlove when he was talking about the knowing how much hurt the publication of his memoir, My Struggle, would cause, and then going ahead and doing it anyway. And I remember there was a very sort of, I mean, he's a very measured speaker anyway, but when there was this very pregnant pause, and then he said something along the lines of, that's a terrible thing to find out about yourself, to know the hurt your book is going to cause, and then to publish it anyway, to know the level of your own ambition. And I remember that being really, even at the time on stage, just getting these kind of frissons of like, wow, there was this is a man who kind of excavated his own psyche and was clearly continuing to do it, even in this case, in the very sort of public arena.
Yeah.
That's the wonderful Katie Kitamura. This was a very special event for us because this was the first public event we had done since COVID. And it was very much, I mean, it was, I guess, 2021 or 2022, 2021, I think. And you see the red poles, which is the scaffolding, because one of the reasons I didn't really get used to Zoom events was we actually stopped events at the end of January 2020 because we had these building works planned. And so we stopped events 6 months without events while the building works happened, and then we picked them up in the autumn of 2020. And then obviously that didn't go to plan. And I remember once things started to open up a little bit, Sylvia and David had the idea of, okay, well, look, we don't have the money for the building works now, so let's take the scaffolding down, let's get back to events. And then there were conversations, if I remember rightly from with the architect, who said no, once you put scaffolding up in a 17th century building, it stays up until the building works are done. And I believe used phrases about structural integrity and things like that, which obviously I think frightened everyone. So this event we did, but Katie was in town. We really wanted to do something to celebrate intimacies. There was also a dear friend, Yakuta Likovacevic, whose book had just come out in English too. And so we decided to fit chairs in where we could. I think we had maybe 25 people. It was invitation only because we didn't know how the space would handle things. And we had this conversation with Katie, and then one with Yakuta, and just I don't know how you remember it, Sylvia, but just the feeling of being back after a year and a half of not only away from the bookshop and away from events, but away from gatherings and away from other people. Seeing that picture and like reading the interviews from that event always make me quite emotional, because it was obviously such a strange, hard time for everyone, and that, at least from the bookshop sort of events perspective, was the first kind of glimmer of something coming back.
Yeah, I think that experience gave us a renowned kind of appreciation for what it is to organize events and get people together in the same room to listen to an important book and author.
Yeah. I was also rocking the same jacket. So Rachel Cusk, of course, talking about, well, specifically Kudos she came for, but really we were talking about the trilogy. So it was marking that sort of monumental moment in literature. And again, a bit like the Knausgaard one, Rachel is such a wonderful interviewee because I think there's always a range with interviewees. Like some people, and this is very rare, fortunately, but some people come with their prepared lines and they say those, and then often it's a good performance for the audience, but it's it's the same conversation they've had in on tour for months. And then at the very other end, you get someone like Rachel who will engage with every question live, and she will think about the words that you have spoken, and she will think new thoughts in front of the audience. And it's from an interviewing perspective, and I think from an audience perspective too, it's the most wonderful experience to have somebody with particularly such brilliant minds that come to the bookstore doing their thinking live in front of you and saying things and thinking things that they haven't said before. I think of that. There was one moment quite early on in this interview where I was asking her about like how she came to the form, that she established with the trilogy, and I described a kind of a way that it might have come about, and she said, I wish it had happened in that lovely way you described, but it was actually like breaking rocks at the side of the road, which was just such such a wonderful moment. And as well as an interviewer, sort of it set me back on myself. And this was the first time I had interviewed Rachel, and I've been fortunate enough to do it many times since. But that was the moment I think I thought, oh, okay, this is going to be something. Like I need to be on my game, and if I am, then the conversation could be something quite special. And Colson Whitehead, wonderful. I mean, such a charmer, like so charismatic, so brilliant. And this is an example of when, unfortunately, we're not quite able to do it in the same way now, but when we used to in the summer have events out on our terrace. So obviously you have the shop background, the shop facade as your background, and then the authors are looking out over Notre-Dame. And I mean, many things have changed. Like the neighborhood has changed in different ways, and the amount of people on the streets in Paris, particularly post Olympics and post Notre Dame, have meant that this year we were unable to do it. But I have to say, seeing that picture, it makes me miss it a little bit.
I want to bring our attention to the signage because we were talking earlier before the event began. Both George and Lawrence were just fascinated and intrigued by creating different kinds of signage and placing them all over their shops. Could you talk a little bit about this particular signage behind you there in that photo?
Well, George wrote that in 2006. The first line is, "Some people call me the Don Quixote of the Latin Quarter." And the problem is I see people reading this every day and I see their smile and I feel I should renew the text because it's quite outdated now, and write something myself, but I see these smiles and I just can't.
That was George Saunders, who Sylvia read from earlier, of course. And George, like, the memory I have of his visit was just how much he charmed the entirety of the team. Like it was such a magical moment. This was the last stop he'd just done a UK tour for Lincoln in the Bardo. This was before he won the Booker Prize. Yeah, this was his initial tour for the book. And he came and he was exhausted because I think he'd done the UK tour on the back of a US tour. And yet he was so generous in his time and his, like, we had the tumbleweeds, young writers who sleep at the shop. And I remember coming in the day after maybe the day after George's event, or he stayed on a couple of days. And one of them had told me how I think he'd been playing the guitar, and like George had come and knocked on the door. They got talking, and they ended up sort of playing and singing together. And this young guy with pretensions to write and to become part of the literary world, to be kind of welcomed by George Saunders into, sort of embraced into that life, and treated as a peer was so wonderful. Yeah, like we haven't, because obviously George's last book that we spoke about was his wonderful book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain. And we recorded a remote interview during COVID. And, that was a lifesaver. And these things, like events like this, are so wonderful. But I have to say, after recording a lot of remote interviews, being able to go back into the space was, yeah, as I said, with Katie and Yakuta earlier, was something special. The brilliant Jenny Zhang. Again, Jenny, this was a special moment for many reasons, but I think it might have been the very first event I hosted at the bookstore was an open mic night where before I worked there, but one of my predecessors, Gemma Burrell, thought it would be a fun idea. She asked me, I can't quite remember why, if I would like to host it. And we just, opened it out. Young writers come in, read something for 5 minutes, and then there were judges who decided who would win it. And this young writer, student, Jenny Zhang, came in and read. I mean, if you're familiar with Jenny's work, like it's incredibly kind of funny and provocative and saucy and just compelling story. And she stormed the evening and won it. And her prize, I think she talks about this in the interview, actually, her prize was like a pulp novel from the 60s. And yeah, so this event was to welcome her back for her short story collection, Sour Heart. And so it was just so nice to have her, probably, I guess, 7 years after, something like that, to have met her as a student, who was learning to write, and then to welcome her back as like a successful, published, celebrated writer was something special. And that's Mina Kandasamy. Mina's book, you can just see it on the display there, When I Hit You, is, I think, truly one of the most radical pieces of, autofiction. It's not necessarily exactly the right term, but that I've read in years. Like, Mina is so brilliant, so politically engaged. It's about her history of domestic violence, about her husband, who was a sort of a Marxist activist, a Marxist politician, but who treated her in the most extraordinarily awful ways. And the one thing that I realized or articulated in this book that I don't remember having quite felt before was how the process of writing about is a sort of, particularly for someone like Mina, as a way of kind of reclaiming your story and taking power back over your life from the people who had taken it away from you, is incredibly moving. And yeah, no, she's an absolutely brilliant writer. And I don't know how well known she necessarily is in the US, but if you haven't read her, really do check her out. Like, she's something to be reckoned with. And yeah, the final one, Miriam Taves. So Miriam came to speak about women talking. And again, we talked about quotable lines or not. I remember her saying during this conversation, she said, like, one of the things people say to me is like, what is this book? It's just a bunch of women talking. I was like, yeah, well, you were warned.
The title gives it away.
Yeah, but Miriam's the novel that followed it up as well, Fight Night, which I think for both Sylvia and I, we at the end of the year as booksellers, we choose our books of the year, and we kind of had to fight over who would get to choose Miriam's book, because it is
I won.
so extraordinary. Well, you always win, so but it was, and I think I found so incredibly moving. And I know, Sylvia, it made you think of George quite a lot. There's this kind of matriarch in the case of Miriam's book, but like this, I don't know, this anarchic energy to her, which really fed
so eccentric and with amazing expressions like Jeepers Creepers, and I love that character.
Yeah, and that is the slideshow. Let me see if we have any comments, questions in the chat function. Let's see. Julie says, congrats to Adam and Sylvia for this wonderful book and to all at Shakespeare and Company for your important contributions to our literary community and to our world. See, Hot Mama says, okay, that's just advice on how to work the screen. Deborah says, happenings should never go out of fashion. Keep them coming. Hot Mama says, any recollections of De Prima?
No, I think she spent quite a lot of time. She came through a few times. I saw in the archives in the 80s, I think. And I think she did an event actually in the 80s, but neither Adam or I were working on the events in the 80s. But yeah, there's a few things from her in the archives, a few photos of her at some of the gatherings here, but not that I remember in person. But I just want to mention that amazing, just talking about the idea of curiosity being at the heart of this. And it really makes me think of the end of Lawrence Ferlinghetti's poem, I Am Waiting, where the end is, I am waiting perpetually and forever for a renaissance of wonder. And I often think of that quote when we're surrounded by people listening to someone at an event. I just wanted to mention that. And I think actually in the interview with Carlo Rovelli, he talks about that idea of like just being in awe of stories and this kind of insatiable desire to keep learning.
Beautiful. Yeah. Our friend Deborah at Synergetic Press says, I was lucky to travel through Paris regularly in the 80s with my author partner, Johnny Dolphin, who was friends with George and Burroughs and Geisen. We stayed a number of times on the first floor study room. Every self-respecting publisher should send their authors to have readings at Shakespeare and Company. Same as true for City Lights. Those days were the highlight of my young publishing years. I will always cherish. Sylvia, I remember you were maybe 10. It is a significant accomplishment you have done to maintain and carry forward the tradition and literary history the bookstore represents. Sylvia, can you share a story with us from when you were a young girl with the cycle of people flowing through?
Wow. I want to talk about Ted Jones because he was one of the most incredible characters that I had the fortune to meet as a child, and he spoke to me like I was an adult, and I truly thought he was my first friend. We were equals. That's how he made me feel. And there's actually a new biography that's just come out about him. So I'm very excited to read that. I think Bloomsbury published it. I'm very excited because Ted Jones is this kind of incredible poet, connected to the Beat Generation, but he's not as well known as he should be. And he was electrifying, and he had this poem that he would often recite to me. And it was something like, if you should see someone walking down the street talking aloud to themselves, don't run away from them, don't fear them, for he is a poet, and you have nothing to fear from the poet but the truth. It's like the name of the poem is called The Truth. Anyway, he was this incredible character. And this was also before emails and telephones. And Ted, when he was in Paris, his meeting point was in front of the bookshop at noon. He would be there. If he was in Paris, he'd be in front of the bookshop at noon with the International Herald Tribune, and he'd be very coolly reading the International Herald Tribune, waiting for a rendezvous if anyone was in town and wanted to see him. And yeah, he was just amazing. And
we have a beautiful photo of Ted and Joyce Mansour and Nanos Valeritas in Paris from I think the 90s or maybe 80s. But Ted was also like hugely into surrealism. That was a big influence of his.
Yeah. He had a quote: "Jazz is my religion, and surrealism is my point of view." Something like that.
Yeah, beautiful.
I should say that it's nothing. There's nothing that the team like more than when people come with stories about meeting Sylvia when she was a child.
Oh,
So if you've got
Finish.
them,
no,
keep
no,
them
no.
coming. Like we had recently the Danish writer Solveig Ball come to the bookstore, and she's so her book on the calculation of volume is setting readers' minds alight at the moment, and we we discovered in the process inviting her that she had spent time at the bookstore, and she had Sylvia found in the library books dedicated to George and Sylvia that Solveig had published in the 80s. But the juicier stuff when she came back said, "Oh, it's Sylvia's babysitter," and then she started reeling off these wonderful memories, which I'm gonna
That
spare
we don't
Sylvia's
want to
blushes.
share
But
with the public. No, no. The better stories are the ones with George, I have to say, because he was maybe I'll become more and more eccentric with age. But that one of the great ones talking about events is that when he thought an event was getting boring, he would come in with a candle and then just set his hair on fire because that's what he liked to do was set his hair on fire. That's how he cut his hair, actually. But the timing, he would just plan to do it at a reading when he felt like really it needed to come to an end. And instead of doing it in a more conventional way, he did it like this. And of course, needless to say, people left the room immediately.
So I have a question from Sarah. Was there one author that you fell madly in love with?
Ooh. Over to you, Adam.
Intellectually, I would say. I mean, it's the interview. It's not in the book for various reasons, but I have to say, interviewing John Berger was one of the most special and so moving experiences of my time doing this. Like I remember there was a lady in the front row just weeping for most of the event. Like I think there was just something so charismatic and so kind and so grounded about John. And it wasn't that close to the end of his life, but it wasn't that far either. And I still think of that as like one of the most magical moments I've had in the bookstore. So yeah, I fell madly in love with John Berger.
Sylvia?
Me too, actually. That was a very spiritual event. And I remember we walked hand in hand to a restaurant afterwards. And it was like time just stopped for that evening. And maybe I would also say that utterly charming actor Ethan Hawke and his book A Bright Ray of Darkness, which I think is a wonderful book on acting. And I mean, he just has so much charisma. It's impossible for the entire room not to fall in love with him. But yeah, I think maybe those two, but I think hopefully there'll be many more.
Yeah. Well, we have come to the top of the hour. And Paul, did you have any final statements, comments, anything you wanted to add before we wrap? Is he there, Paul?
Oh, that's to me. I just want to say that the legacies of Shakespeare and Company and City Lights, I mean, it is one of the central kind of literary events. I think what we inspire people to do is with this curiosity. And so I'm just hoping this will continue on in the same way that Sylvia and David and Adam have carried Shakespeare, that we will be able to carry that forward at City Lights. And so you're an inspiration, as always, from the very beginning. George started in the conversations of George and Lawrence, and that continues to this day. And so thank you both so much.
Thank
you.
you.
We call you guys our sister bookshop in San
Absolutely.
Francisco. So yeah, we are in conversation, aren't we? So let's keep the conversation going.
Well, this was a homecoming of sorts, so we really appreciate you gracing our virtual halls, and congratulations really on a truly magnificent collection. It's always a pleasure to have you in our orbit. And Lawrence always spoke with very great affection about you, so I think it would bring him great joy to know that we're hosting this in this way. So Adam, best to you in all future endeavors. May the series live on, and the best to you
Thank
in all
you.
your personal projects. And Sylvia, we will catch you on the rebound. And again, very, very grateful. I want to also remind everyone we have posted links in the chat function with which you may purchase copies of the book. Or better yet, if you're in the hood and you're in San Francisco, come on down, pay us a visit. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district, and we are open 7 days a week. Our hours are 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. And of course, today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and our educational outreach, which is all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So long, everyone. Take care. Be kind to each other. And we hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your support. I also love all these hearts and things that are going on the screen. I never do Zoom events, but I'm loving this. Thank you for your support and hearts. I love it.